Number 5. Elsie Ott. At the age of 28, Elsie joined the Army Nurse Corps in September of 1941. She was stationed in Karachi, India, and was later ordered by the Army to air evacuate the wounded soldiers back to Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. At the time, Elsie had only been with the military for about 8 months. She had no flight experience, and in fact, she was only given 24-hour notice to prepare for the air evacuation flight. She also wasn't given any medical instructions or supply list came with the order, and her only assistant was a sergeant with a medical technician background. After her departure from India, she made her first stop in Oman to refuel, then made another stop in Ghana, where she accepted more wounded soldiers and transferred all of them into a new plane. She finally made her last stop in South America to restock more supplies. Since every stop destination she made was not under the control of the U.S. Army Air Force, she had to arrange and pay meals for all the patients and herself from her own pocket. All in all, it was a success. The flight took a span of 6 days, and all the wounded survived after receiving medical treatment. 2 months later, in recognition of her heroism, she was awarded and became the first woman to receive the United States Air Medal. Number 4. Ludmila Pavlichenko. Regarded as one of the deadliest female snipers in history, Ludmila was born in a small town in Ukraine on July 12, 1916. At just the age of 14, she started working as a grinder at their local metal factory, and later joined a shooting club and quickly developed into an amateur sharpshooter. She even received a marksman certificate and a sharpshooter badge. But it took 10 years when she finally put her skills to use. On June 22, 1941, 24-year-old Ludmila rushed to join the Soviet Army after German troops poured into the Soviet Union. At first, she was denied by the Army, insisting that she should instead work as a combat nurse. But after she showcased her sniping skills on the field, the Army changed their mind, and she was immediately deployed into the battlefield. One of her tactics was that she used mannequins as decoys by tying them to trees to draw enemy fire, and from then, she was able to locate her enemies and pick them out. She also tied strips of red cloths to branches to disorient the enemy and to hide her location whenever she pulls the trigger. She became so good at this that the enemy snipers began to seek her out and target her. In fact, she was so deadly and feared by the enemy, they nicknamed her Lady Death. However, there was one occasion where she was fired at by an enemy sniper while she was scouting on a tree. Even though the bullet missed her and nearly hit her, she purposely let go of the tree branch and fell 12 feet to the ground. She played dead in fear that if she got up, she would be on the enemy's sights. She lied on the ground for hours until nightfall, when she finally crawled away to safety. Due to her injury from the fall and other major unsustainable wounds, she was finally evacuated from battle. After her retirement, she was sent to America to build international support for the war. There, she became the first Soviet Union citizen to be welcomed at the White House, and even became lifelong friends with the First Lady. After returning back to her country, she was never sent back to the field. Instead, she served as a sniper trainer during the remainder of the war. At the end, she was awarded the highest honorary title, which was the Gold Star Medal of the Soviet Union. Number 3. Ruby Bradley. Born on December 19, 1907 in Spencer, West Virginia, Ruby was commissioned in the Army Corps at the age of 27 and served as a surgical nurse at Walter Reed General Hospital in Washington, D.C. On Pearl Harbor Day in December 7, 1941, she was stationed on the Luzon Island in the Philippines, serving as a hospital administrator. During this time, the Japanese overran the island, but she, along with other soldiers and locals, managed to hide in the hills. However, it didn't take too long until she and the others were captured after one of the locals had betrayed them. She spent over 3 years as a prisoner of war at the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, and for the next several months, she and other nurses set up a clinic to provide medical help to the other prisoners. She healed various injuries, comforted the wounded, and even sought to feed starving children by smuggling food into her pockets whenever she could. It was not until on February 3, 1945, when the U.S. troops arrived at the camp, freeing the prisoner after years of captivity, and at this time, Ruby weighed only 80 pounds. After the war, Ruby stayed with the Army, and she attended UCLA for additional nursing education. Later in 1950, she served as the 8th Army Chief Nurse during the Korean War, working at the front lines. At one point during the war, when thousands of enemy soldiers had surrounded them while she was dealing with wounded patients, a plane was sent to evacuate the soldiers. She refused to leave the wounded behind and ordered the soldiers to load all her patients into the plane before departing. Luckily, Even though she was the last one who jumped aboard the plane, she didn't suffer from any major injuries, even after her ambulance exploded just seconds from an enemy bombshell. By the time she retired in 1963 as a colonel, Ruby had earned 34 medals and citations, most received by a woman in the U.S. Army's history. She was also rewarded the International Red Cross highest honor, the Florence Nightingale Medal. Sadly, she passed away in May 2002 at the age of 94 and was buried with honors at the Arlington Cemetery. Number 2. Reba Whittle. After graduating from nursing school, Reba enlisted into the Army Nurse Corps in 1941. Due to her higher education, she entered the military as a second lieutenant and was stationed in Sacramento. Later in January 1944, she graduated from the Army Air Force, and just under 8 months later, Reba logged over 500 hours of flight time with at least 40 missions under her belt. Later in September 27, 1944, while on a mission to Belgium to collect casualties, her plane was hit by enemy flak and crashed to the ground. Luckily, she survived and only suffered from a concussion and minor injuries on her forehead. As soon as she crawled from the wreckage, the enemy soldiers captured her and she was taken to the nearby village for treatment. Since she was the first female POW, they were unsure how to handle the situation, so throughout her imprisonment, instead of her working in the fields, she was sent to one POW hospital after another to help treat the wounded laborers. Just a month staying at the camp, a representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross saw her and notified the State Department, who then began immediate work for her release. She and other POW patients were sent by train to Switzerland and then transported back to the United States. Upon her return, the injuries she sustained in the crash prevented her from flying again, and the U.S. government requested that she not talk about her experiences. The Army also awarded her the Air Medal and a Purple Heart. However, her status as a POW was undocumented, and she was denied disability or POW retirement benefits. While female nurses who were imprisoned in Asia had received heroes' receptions upon their release, her story was kept quiet by the Army and barely noticed by the media. She spent several years during the 1950s seeking physical and psychological disability compensation, but only have received partial settlement. She later died of breast cancer in 1981 and was buried in the National Cemetery in San Francisco. It took 2 years after her death that she was finally posthumously recognized as a POW. Number 1. Eileen Niern. She was born in London on March 15, 1921, into an Anglo-Spanish family, but later moved to France where she spent most of her childhood life and became fluent in French. On 1940, when France fell, she, along with her family, fled through Spain and eventually arrived in England. From there, she joined the Army and became a member of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. Since her language skills were highly prized, the Army decided to recruit her into the Special Operations Executive. At first, she worked as a home-based signals operator, receiving messages from agents in the field. Then on March 2, 1944, she was given a code name Rose and was assigned to be an undercover agent in France. Her mission was to travel around the country and set up numerous communication networks that wirelessly link London and France. The objective was to organize sources of finance for the French resistance, who were fighting along with the Allied troops. However, the enemy had penetrated some of those networks, and members of the resistance and undercover agents were continuously looking for new safe houses. Over time, they became increasingly effective at tracking the locations of these networks, and after Eileen's several narrow escapes, her transmitter was detected, and she was eventually arrested. In spite of the interrogations she received, she maintained her cover and claimed that she was just an assistant of a businessman who had been asked to send messages to his clients. However, they refused to believe her, and she was sent to a concentration camp. Later in 1944, she and other laborers were forced to march by night to be transferred into another camp. Eileen and 2 other French women took the opportunity and fled into the forest. They were briefly arrested by the state patrol in the area, but surprisingly, she somehow managed to persuade them that they were French volunteers and had no papers with them. After several nights without food, they finally took refuge in a church, and the priest who found them graciously hid them in the bell tower. After months in hiding, they finally left the place safely after the U.S. troops liberated the area. Eileen received a bravery award badge from the French government, and she was also appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire by King George VI. She returned back to live with her sister in London, and later in September 2010, at the age of 89, she died alone from heart failure in her seaside flat.